Chapter 1. Imperial Duties. The rain hammered down on the slick slate roofs of Altdorf, blurring the spires of the temples and staining the sky a perpetual shade of bruised gray. The city stank of piss, wet horse, and cheap pipeweed, and Aldrich Margrave was already soaked to the bone as he trudged through the cobbled courtyard of the Office of Imperial Revenues. His waxed cloak clung to him like wet parchment, and every clack of his boots echoed in the puddles like a curse. He'd hoped, prayed, even, that this day would be uneventful, that the morose-faced clerk behind the iron-grated window would slide forward a list of overdue merchants or misplaced land titles. Something simple. But when the door to Supervisor Klemt's office creaked open, Aldrich knew by the man's pale expression and finger-tapping the parchment that it wouldn't be so. "Aldrich," Klemt had said, voice thin and nasal. "You're headed north." Aldrich said nothing, simply pulled the page closer with a gloved hand. His eyes scanned the text, expecting the name of some petty barony or wayward village in Hochland. Instead, one word snagged on his vision like a barbed hook. "Wolfgart." "Never heard of it," Aldrich muttered, frowning. "Where in Mars' name is it?" "Coastal Nordland, near the Pale Cliffs. No imperial tithe received from them in nearly 12 years. 12 years, Aldrich's brow furrowed. Then why the sudden interest? Klimt leaned forward, tapping his fingers on a dark stain in the wood that looked suspiciously like old blood. "Because Wulfgart still appears on the books, still listed as active, which means someone's pocketing imperial coin, or, worse, someone's avoiding the Emperor's justice." Aldrich considered the seal at the bottom of the parchment. Official orders, no wiggle room, no appeal, no delays. "You'll leave by week's end," Klimt added, sliding a leather satchel across the desk. "Map, ledger, letters of authority, travel papers, and a writ for imperial detachment should you need to call in armsmen." "Generous," Aldrich said, voice flat. "You'll be traveling alone." "Of course I will," Aldrich thought bitterly. The journey from Altdorf was as miserable as it was monotonous. Cold winds screamed through the Reichwald forest, bending ancient pines into hissing serpents of bark and needle. Aldrich's coach stank of mildew and rat piss. He shared it for part of the journey with a merchant whose breath reeked of cabbage and cowardice. When he mentioned Wolfgart, the man went silent, then got off at the next village without so much as a nod goodbye. The roads grew worse the further north he traveled. From paved trade routes they descended into mud-choked paths, then finally into graveled nothingness. Twice his coach became mired in swampy ruts. The driver, a sour-faced Nordlander with a jaw like a clenched fist, cursed under his breath, refused to help, and eventually abandoned Aldrich 2 days from the coast. Aldrich walked the rest of the way, feet blistered, boots ruined, cloak stiff with salt from the sea-sprayed wind. The further he went, the less familiar everything became. Villages shrank into hamlets, inns turned to boarded husks. Locals grew silent. When he asked about Wolfgart, they offered only sidelong glances and spit over their shoulders. "The Millendile ain't right out there," muttered a one-eyed woman in a fishing town called Breakowl. "Not since the Black Sea moon." "Explain," Aldrich demanded. But she only shook her head, fingers tightening on the rusted iron token around her neck, a crude charm to Menan. He slept in the stables that night. The innkeep wouldn't even let him through the door. On the final morning of his journey, the landscape shifted. The land flattened into barren, rock-strewn earth. Wind howled ceaselessly from the churning gray sea to the west. Ahead, jagged cliffs rose from the shoreline like the spines of a long-dead god, and there, nestled in a horseshoe of rock, was Wolfgart. Aldrich paused at the crest of a hill to observe it. Smoke curled from chimneys, but there were no sounds of work, no fishermen hauling nets, no shouting of children, no hammer on anvil. Just a deathly stillness, broken only by the shriek of gulls circling something below the cliffs. He took a long breath. The air reeked of brine and rotting kelp. Behind him, the wind whispered through the grass, like a warning in a forgotten tongue. Adjusting the satchel over his shoulder, Aldrich descended toward Wulfgart, toward duty, toward something that had waited too long in the deep. Chapter 2. A Road Less Traveled. The wind had teeth. It gnawed through Aldrich's cloak and nipped at his neck like a starved dog. Each step along the marsh-choked road north of Breakow was a fight, against the sucking mud that clung to his boots, against the cold that crept through his spine, and against the oppressive silence that surrounded him like a shroud. Only the creak of leather and the distant cries of seabirds accompanied his trudging march. The road, if it could be called that, had long since given up any pretense of civility. Grass grew thick between the ruts, and the stone mile markers had crumbled into lichen-covered nubs, their inscriptions lost to erosion and time. Trees leaned too closely over the path, their gnarled limbs twisted as though clawing at passers-by. Every so often, Aldrich would catch movement in the corner of his eye, a flicker of shadow, a flash of pale shape. But when he turned, there was nothing but swaying branches and whispering leaves. His supplies were running low. The salted meat from Altdorf had begun to sour in the damp, and the hardtack was infested with weevils. He chewed through it anyway, teeth grinding grit and shell with every miserable bite. By the third day on foot, the villages stopped entirely. He came upon one, more a cluster of hovels than a true settlement, half sunken into bog. The doors had been torn from their hinges, moss and mold coated the stone walls like lichenous scabs. A crude totem stood at the edge of the path, a bundle of fish bones tied with seaweed, dripping brine despite the dry air. It reeked of salt and rot. Aldrich did not linger. It was just past midday when he encountered the old man. He sat on a splintered crate beside a withered oak, hunched beneath a patched cloak, a battered tricorn hat pulled low over his face. A rusted hook had replaced his right hand, and his left leg was bound in stained bandages. At his feet, a fishing spear lay broken in half, its shaft dark with dried blood. Aldrich slowed. "You there, old man. This the road to Wulfgart?" The figure didn't answer. His shoulders twitched once, like a shiver. Then he lifted his head. His face was a ruin of scars and half-healed burns. One eye was clouded, the other unnervingly sharp, pale blue and glassy like a dead fish. "Turn back," he rasped, voice like gravel and oil. "Ain't no tithe worth a soul it'll cost ye." Aldrich frowned. "You know who I am?" The man chuckled, a hacking, phlegmy sound. "Empire don't send their dogs this far north unless they're after coin or bones. Wolfgart owes a tithe. I'm here to collect it. No one lives in Wulfgart, not rightly." The old man's face grew grim. "They've all been touched by the sea." "You mean they've gone mad?" "Duh." He pointed the hook toward the horizon. "I mean they ain't people anymore." Aldrich crossed his arms. "You're telling me an entire village just turned?" The old man's voice dropped. Some years ago, during the black tide, the moon hung low over the water, red as fresh spilled blood. The sea rose, flooded the lower docks. That's when it started. The whispers. Men walking into the surf with smiles on their faces. Women birthing still things with gills. Children speaking in tongues that curdled the milk. Aldrich scoffed. "You expect me to believe this? Sounds like hag's gossip." "You'll see," the old man whispered. "You'll see 'em. Salted dead with barnacles in their bellies and voices like drowned men. You'll hear 'em too. The sea whispers. Once you hear it, it never stops." Aldrich turned to leave. "Save your madness. I have duties to fulfill." The old man didn't respond, but as Aldrich walked away he heard it, just barely, beneath the whine of the wind, a low, gurgling chant, like a prayer gargled through waterlogged lungs. That night, Aldrich camped beneath a dead tree, wrapping himself tight in his damp cloak. The stars were hidden behind a veil of fast-moving clouds, and the moon was a bloated yellow smear above the blackened horizon. Insects chirped, then fell silent, one by one, as though something vast approached in the darkness. His dreams were soaked in seawater. He stood upon a reef of bone, watching a figure drift beneath the waves. A woman, her hair floating around her like kelp, eyes open and black. Her mouth moved in silent invocation, and her fingers, long, jointless things ending in suckered tips, beckoned him down. A great shape moved behind her, a shadow of tentacles and teeth and eye-rimmed flesh that writhed with impossible grace. When he woke, he was gasping, his throat full of salt. At dawn, the path narrowed into a cleft between jagged cliffs. Foam sprayed up from the sea far below, and the screeches of gulls were replaced with deeper cries, like seals, but wrong. Too human. As he crested the ridge, a cairn of stones came into view, not random, but stacked deliberately, each one engraved with crude, swirling sigils. He reached out to brush one with his glove, and the stone was slick with something. Viscous. Foul-smelling. Seaweed? Those veins? The cairn throbbed once, faintly, beneath his hand. He stepped back, heart pounding, and hurried on. By nightfall, Wolfgart lay just ahead, veiled in mist and crouched like a dying thing on the edge of the world. Behind him, the cairn still pulsed, ever so faintly, like something beneath the soil was breathing. Chapter 3. Arrival at Wulfgart. The first thing Aldrich noticed as he crossed into Wulfgart was the silence. Not the ordinary hush of a remote village in early morning, but a deep, oppressive quiet that felt carved into the very air, so thick it pressed against his ears and throat like a damp shroud. There were no barking dogs, no calling voices, no clang of hammer on anvil or whistle of kettles on hearths. Only the distant wheeze of the wind threading through ruined buildings and the muffled slap of sea against stone far below. Sea mist clung low and thick, coiling through the skeletal remains of the harbor. Aldrich stepped carefully, boots crunching on fish bones and shattered shells. The wooden pier had collapsed in several places, long black fingers of tide-rotted planks jutting from the surf like drowned limbs. Tattered fishing nets hung from splintered posts mottled with rot and barnacles. Swaying like wet funeral banners, the stench was foul, brine, decaying fish, and something worse beneath it. Sweet and putrid like bloated flesh. He covered his mouth with a gloved hand, eyes scanning the waterfront. No boats in the harbor, no signs of trade, just rusted anchors tangled with seaweed and rusting traps abandoned in heaps. A few gulls pecked at the remains of something washed up near the shoreline, something that had once been human, but now was little more than a torso, split down the middle, ribs peeled open like a gutted crab. Aldrich swallowed hard and moved on. He followed the main thoroughfare, little more than a muddy lane between stone cottages and timbered hovels, most of them sagging under the weight of neglect. Roofs were caved in, shutters hung loose on twisted hinges. A thin layer of moss covered every surface, green-black and slimy. More symbols had been carved into doors and lintels, spirals, eyes, tentacles, unfamiliar glyphs worn smooth by wind and salt. Then came movement, a flicker of shadow in a doorway, a narrow face peering from a broken window, a figure standing stock still at the edge of the square, watching him. Aldrich stopped. The woman, if it was a woman, was barefoot, dressed in a sodden shift that clung to her thin frame. Her skin was waxy and pallid, with a grayish hue, like something pulled too long from cold water. Her eyes were wrong, milky and bulbous. fixed, unblinking on him as he approached. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. "Tax collector," Aldrich called, trying to sound firm. "I come on orders from Altorf. I require access to village records and a meeting with your reeve." No answer. More figures appeared from the mist. 6, 7, 10, all moving slowly like sleepwalkers. They emerged from alleyways and crumbling homes, silent as the dead, their eyes all fixed on him. Some limped, some dragged limbs that didn't seem to work properly. One tall man had a gaping hole in his cheek, through which Aldrich could see several dark, writhing shapes. Tentacles? Worms? Retreating into the cavity like startled eels. The crowd didn't advance, but it didn't back away either. It simply watched, as though Aldrich was a new specimen laid bare upon a slab. A sharp crack of wood behind him made him spin, hand flying to the dagger at his belt, but it was only a shutter flapping loose in the wind. When he turned back, most of the villagers were gone, vanished into doorways or mist without a sound. Only the woman remained, still watching him. She opened her mouth. What emerged was not speech, but a low gurgling sound, like water being sucked through a narrow pipe, full of phlegm and drowning. Her tongue lolled from her mouth, thick and misshapen, covered in dark nodules that pulsed slowly, like eggs waiting to hatch. Aldrich backed away. "Enough of this," he muttered, turning sharply and heading for the largest structure in the village, the town hall, if such a place still existed. The doors to the hall were open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and rot. The rafters were splintered and sagging. Broken chairs lay strewn about like the aftermath of a riot. A faded banner bearing the Empire's two-tailed comet hung in tatters above the hearth, so stained it looked dipped in blood. But there were ledgers. Rows of shelves lined the back wall, heavy with water-damaged tomes and scrolls. Aldrich moved quickly, lighting a stub of tallow from his satchel and shielding it against the draft. He scanned dates. Most records stopped 8 years ago. The ink had run on many pages, replaced by strange marginal notes, marks he did not recognize, glyphs repeating in feverish patterns. He turned to one heavy ledger and opened it to a bookmarked page. Instead of names and coin tallies, there was only a drawing, done in jagged charcoal, a massive eye, dozens of them in fact, eyes upon eyes, each dripping seawater, each circled in tiny runes, and in the center, rising from a mass of writhing tendrils, a gaping mouth filled with rows of triangular teeth, like those of a deep-sea predator. Something splattered behind him. He froze, then slowly turned. The woman was in the doorway. Her mouth was open wide, too wide, and something long and slick spilled from it onto the floor with a wet slap. It was a tongue, or had once been. Now it resembled a leech, thick and glossy and twitching. It wriggled toward him, leaving a trail of viscous ichor as it moved. Aldrich snatched up the candle, backing away. She stepped forward. Then another figure appeared beside her, then 2 more. All in silence, all with mouths ajar, limbs wrong, joints swollen and warped. One man's skin hung from his frame like a loose coat, swaying as he moved. Another had a crab's claw where a hand should be, clicking rhythmically. They began to chant, not in words, but in a gurgling, bubbling harmony. The same sound he had heard in his dreams, like air escaping lungs at the bottom of the sea. Aldrich ran. He shoved past the woman, slipping in the slime left by her leech tongue, catching himself on the doorframe before sprinting into the mist-choked street. His boots hammered against mud and stone. Behind him the chanting rose, rising like a tide. The whole village was waking, and it knew he was here. Chapter 4. The Salted Silence. Aldrich stood panting beneath the rain-slicked awning of the crumbling inn, the flickering lantern above the door casting a dim, jaundiced light that barely pushed back the encroaching sea mist. The sign above him creaked in the wind, barely hanging on by rusted chains. The name was illegible, washed away by salt and years, but the faint outline of what might have once been a fish or squid remained, its features eroded into something formless and grotesque. He shoved the heavy door open with his shoulder. It groaned like something in pain. The interior was worse than he'd imagined. Salt had eaten through nearly every surface. The floorboards were warped and bowed, pale with mold and slick with damp. A rank stench of mildew, fish oil, and something chemical like copper and spoiled blood filled the room. Tattered netting hung from the ceiling like cobwebs. The hearth in the far wall was cold, the ash long dead and gray. The only sound was the rhythmic drip of water from a hole in the roof onto a steadily growing pool beside the bar. A figure loomed behind the counter. A woman, or at least the twisted semblance of one. Her skin was blotched with bloated, scaly patches that glistened in the dim light. Her hair hung in limp ropes, slick with moisture, and her eyes were sunken and cloudy, as if staring from beneath inches of water. She made no sound as Aldrich approached. "I require a room," he said, trying to ignore the writhing nausea coiling in his gut. "Just for the night. I'll pay in imperial coin." Her eyes flicked once, down to the bag at his belt, then back up to him. Slowly, mechanically, she turned, retrieved a rusted key from a peg behind the bar, and placed it on the counter. "Second floor, end of the hall," she murmured, her voice like bubbles bursting in thick soup. Aldrich picked up the key with 2 fingers, noting the faint residue of slime on the iron. The woman never looked away from him as he mounted the stairs, her head tilting slightly to one side, as if hearing something from far away. The hallway upstairs was darker still, lit only by a single lamp sputtering weakly at the far end. The walls were warped, the wood slick with condensation. As Aldrich walked, he noticed the carvings, shallow gouges along the walls, crudely etched with a knife or claw. At first they seemed like damage, but then he recognized the pattern. Eyes, tentacles, mouths. Symbols that twisted in on themselves, glyphs that felt like they moved when he looked too long. His room was the last on the left. The door moaned as he opened it, revealing a small chamber barely large enough for the cot, a warped writing desk, and a wash basin full of murky water. The window was encrusted with salt, nearly opaque. The sheets smelled of mold. Something small scurried into the wall as he stepped inside. Aldrich dropped his satchel on the desk and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering flame of the single candle left for him. The day's journey had left him soaked, filthy, and exhausted, but he didn't dare remove his boots. Something about this place demanded constant readiness, like sleeping among wolves. He drew out the ledger he'd taken from the town hall. The same grotesque eye-filled sketch filled its final page, surrounded by dense margins of symbols, many of them matching those carved into the walls. He flipped back through earlier entries, names, coin tallies, ship manifests, all increasingly frantic. The last legible entry, dated some 6 years ago, simply read, "He comes from the drowned place. The tithe is no longer of gold but of flesh." He shuddered. A soft scratching sound interrupted the silence. Aldrich stood immediately, hand on the hilt of his dagger. The scratching came again, from behind the wall. No, from within it. He stepped to the wall and pressed his ear against the damp wood. Scritch, scritch off, scritch off. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Not vermin. Too methodical, like fingernails or claws. He backed away. Suddenly the sounds stopped. Then a voice, gurgling, whispery, just on the edge of understanding, filtered through the boards. "It sees you." Aldrich's blood turned to ice. He stared at the wall, muscles tense, waiting. Nothing. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Later that night, as he sat at the desk, trying to make sense of the symbols in the ledger by candlelight, he heard it again, this time from the hallway. Footsteps, slow, uneven. Bare feet slapping against wet wood. He opened the door a crack and peered out. The corridor was empty. The lamp had gone out. But the carvings on the walls, they were different. They had changed. Where before there had been abstract shapes, now the symbols were more distinct, rows of eyes staring outward, elongated mouths pulled into silent screams, limbs that ended in barbed fins and barnacles. One figure in particular was newly etched, a towering humanoid shape with a head like an open maw, arms that trailed into tangled ropes of tentacles. He closed the door and bolted it. Then he saw the final horror of the night, etched into the inside of the door itself, in a script that hadn't been there when he entered. It was his name, Aldrich Margrave. Beneath it, scrawled in thick gouges that dripped salt water from the grooves, Tithebringer, he waits beneath. Sleep came eventually, not from comfort, but from exhaustion so complete it crushed his senses into numbness. But even then, the silence was not empty. It was full of breathing, and the sea, oh, how it whispered. Chapter 5. Night of the Seashands. Aldrich woke with a jolt. His body snapped upright as if pulled by invisible strings. The thin blanket tangled around his limbs like seaweed around a drowning man. His heart pounded, breath ragged, mouth dry with the bitter tang of bile. He didn't know what had awoken him. There was no knock, no dream, no noise, and yet something felt wrong. The air was heavy, the silence too deep. Then he heard it, faint at first, carried on the breathless wind through the crusted window, a strange, low melody that rose and fell like a tide. It wasn't singing in the way a man sings a hymn or a bawdy tavern tune. No, this was deeper, more primal, a chorus not made by human lungs but by lungs filled with brine, gurgling, wet, inharmonic yet patterned, notes that twisted in on themselves and made Aldrich's stomach lurch. He crossed to the window, scraped away a film of salt and rot with the edge of his dagger and peered out. The village was awake, or at least it was moving. Dozens of figures, men, women, children, drifted silently through the mist-choked streets below. None carried lanterns, none spoke. Their movements were slow, deliberate, dreamlike. From above, Aldrich could see their feet dragging through the mud, robes and rags soaked and slapping wetly against their legs. Some walked upright, some hunched over as if straining to carry a weight. Others crawled, elbows and knees slick with mire, eyes locked on the horizon, mouths open as if in silent prayer. They were heading east toward the cliffs. The chant grew louder. Aldrich's hands trembled as he dressed. His instincts screamed to stay inside, to bolt the door and pray until dawn, but curiosity gnawed harder than fear. He slipped into the corridor, which now reeked of brine and decay, and descended the stairs slowly, each footstep echoing like a hammer strike. The inn was empty. The woman at the bar was gone. Only the steady drip, drip, drip of water remained, pooling into something darker than just rain. Outside, the fog clung tighter than ever, cold and oily on the skin. Aldrich kept to the shadows, following the shapes as they drifted through the lanes, out past the rotting pier, and toward the narrow cliff path. The song swelled now, choral, discordant, drenched in an ancient wrongness that made his teeth ache. The words, if they were words, shifted as he listened. Sometimes he heard them in Reichspiel. Other times they became harsh clicks and croaks. More often they were simply sounds, distant, gurgling, alien. He crested the hill above the sea just in time to see the first villagers walk off the edge. His heart stopped. But they didn't fall. They walked down. There was a slope there now, made from barnacle-crusted rock that hadn't been there earlier in the day, slick with writhing seaweed, a natural formation that seemed wrong, as though summoned or shaped in the hours between dusk and now. The villagers descended it like pilgrims to a holy site, vanishing one by one into the black surf below. Eldred crept closer, every muscle in his body taut. He reached the edge and looked down. The water should have been black. The sky was moonless, the clouds thick, but beneath the waves there was a glow, faint and green, like corpse light filtered through algae. Shapes moved there. Not fish, not eels, nothing that swam like anything natural. Tentacles, dozens, hundreds, cords of flesh, some lined with suckers, others ending in barbed hooks or fleshy eyes. They swam lazily through the water, as if circling something massive in the depths, something that pulsed with terrible, slow rhythms, a heart too large for mortal flesh. Aldrich's gaze fell to the villagers. They stood waist-deep in the surf, arms raised, bodies swaying with the chant. One woman had opened her shirt and was clawing at her chest with hooked fingernails, tearing away flesh to reveal gills pulsing beneath. A man beside her convulsed, dropping to his knees as something slithered from his mouth, a long, translucent creature, like a squid made of glass, twitching before vanishing beneath the waves. Then came the birth. The child screamed, not in fear but in exultation, as a woman nearby knelt in the surf, her belly bloated and twitching. With a wet rupture, something tore free from her abdomen. Not a babe, but a mass of wriggling limbs and mucus. It flopped into the water with a splash, let out a horrible, gargled cry, and vanished into the waiting embrace of the deep. Eldritch staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He stumbled. A rock rolled under his boot, sending him down the slope several paces. One of the villagers turned, a man whose face was entirely smooth, no eyes, no mouth, just gills fluttering open and closed across his jawline. He made a noise. Not speech. A call. And the others turned. They saw him. The chant ceased. For a single breath, the only sound was the wind and the distant thrum of something massive moving far below the sea. Then the villagers screamed. Not with mouths, not with lungs, but through the air itself. A pressure, like a great weight on Eldred's chest. He ran, up the slope, slipping, boots soaked, heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, limbs thrashed in the surf. Some villagers dropped to all fours, crawling after him with grotesque speed, tongues lolling, claws digging into the stone. One man's jaw unhinged, snapping open in 4 directions like a crustacean's maw, teeth spiraling inward. Eldrick reached the hill's crest and fled into the fog. The chant resumed as he ran, soft again, almost gentle, a lullaby sung by the sea. And behind it, he heard a single word, spoken without sound, pressed into his skull like a brand. Chapter 6. The Hidden Shrine. The village chapel loomed at the edge of Wulfgart like a broken tooth jutting from diseased gums. Its steeple had collapsed years ago, snapped and swallowed by the sea wind, leaving jagged beams exposed like ribs to the sky. The stone walls were thick with moss and salt rot, and the once proud icon of Sigmar above the entry arch had been defaced beyond recognition. A crude spiral had been gouged into the old stone, etched with deep, deliberate hatred. Aldrich approached at dawn, the sun barely rising behind a sky so thick with gray that light barely touched the earth. He hadn't slept, not after what he'd witnessed the night before. The villagers had returned before morning, vanishing into their homes like insects scuttling back beneath rocks. The fog had remained thick, unnaturally so, curling into his room through the cracks in the window frame. And now, the chapel called to him, not with sound, but with gravity, an aching pull in his gut that demanded investigation. The wooden doors resisted him at first, swollen with moisture and warped from years of neglect. With a groaning crack, they gave way under his shoulder, and the scent hit him immediately. Mildewed, rotted parchment, and coppery blood. The interior was worse. The pews had been pushed aside in a rough semicircle around the altar, now warped and overgrown with a nest of black seaweed. Fish bones, shells, and small humanoid skulls were woven into the strands. The once golden icon of Sigmar had been replaced by a rotting plank covered in symbols, none Ildrich recognized. Spirals, eyes, writhing tentacles, and an alien, jagged rune that burned in his vision even when he looked away. The stained glass windows had been smashed, and what fragments remained were painted over with crude images, scenes of drowning, of villagers offering severed limbs into the sea, of a great maw rising from beneath the waves to receive them. Haldrick stepped forward, and the floor groaned beneath his weight. There was something under it. He crouched beside the altar and brushed aside the seaweed and bones, revealing a trap door carved directly into the flagstones. It had no handle, only a deep groove, worn by fingernails. He slipped the edge of his dagger into the seam and pried it open. A blast of fetid air hissed from the darkness below. It smelled like the inside of a grave, steeped in brine. He descended slowly. The ladder was slick with slime. Each rung groaned ominously as he lowered himself into the hidden chamber. After 10 feet, the light from above vanished completely, swallowed by damp stone and creeping blackness. The walls were cold and wet. His boots splashed into a shallow pool at the bottom, the water warm and viscous. He lit his last stub of tallow candle. The room stretched out before him, a stone chamber not carved by tools, but worn into shape, as though by the passage of something massive and many-limbed. The walls pulsed slightly, the stone slick and veined, weeping brine. Glyphs covered every surface, scratched with bone, finger, or claw, layered over one another in chaotic repetition. They spiraled toward the center of the chamber, toward the altar. And behind the altar stood the idol. Aldrich froze. It was nearly 10 feet tall, carved, or perhaps grown, from a column of deep-sea coral, black and glistening. It depicted a monstrous form, a mass of tentacles writhing from a central body, each tendril ending in mouths, eyes, claws, or unidentifiable appendages. The torso was semi-humanoid but elongated and bloated, ribs pushing through the flesh, barnacles and shell-like growths clustered across its flanks. The head, or what passed for one, was a maw. Nothing more. A great circular mouth lined with inward-facing teeth, layered like a shark's, stretching endlessly inward into darkness. Around the maw were dozens of smaller eyes, irregular and twitching, some blind, others rolling in opposite directions. It was not a sculpture. It was a presence. The very air around it pulsed with slow, nauseating rhythm, like breathing. The candle flickered violently. Aldrich felt something inside his skull tremble, as if something were shifting in his mind that had been buried too deep to reach. And then he saw the bodies. Arranged at the idol's base like supplicants were a dozen villagers, kneeling, motionless. Their skin was pale and swollen, eyes rolled back, mouths open. Each had carved into their chests the same jagged rune that adorned the chapel above. Their bellies were split open, not with knives, but with some force that had burst outward. The insides were gone, hollowed out. Something had grown through them. Their arms were raised in silent worship. The candle dimmed again, and from the maw of the idol came a sound, a breath. Not wind, not air. Her breath, wet, heavy, sucking inward. Then a whisper, like silt stirred at the bottom of the sea. Yakarlash. Aldrich's mind reeled. He stumbled backward, clutching at his head as a vision overwhelmed him. A city beneath the waves, filled with spiraling spires of coral and flesh, where eyeless things swam through open plazas and fed on the drowned. A throne of bone and tendon, a mouth that opened wide enough to swallow ships whole, and from it a voice, ancient and eternal, not heard through ears, but felt in the blood. The tithe is begun. The maw awakens. The bodies around the idols stirred. Their heads turned slowly toward him. Eyes, once rolled back, now focused. Black and glistening. Mouths stretched open, revealing tongues split into wriggling tendrils. Aldrich fled. He sprinted up the ladder, slipping on the rungs as fingers brushed his boots. He slammed the trapdoor behind him and threw himself against it, chest heaving, candle extinguished by his wild breath. The chapel was no longer empty. The pews were full now, filled with villagers, seated and silent, all staring forward toward the altar. And the altar was bleeding. A slow trickle of black ichor ran down its side, pooling around Aldrich's feet. The icon above it twitched once. He ran into the dawn. But behind him, from beneath the floorboards, the idol breathed. And Yakarlash dreamed. Chapter 7. The Tithe of Flesh. Aldrich didn't remember how he made it back to the inn. His mind was a whirlpool of fevered images, black ichor pulsing down stones, supplicant corpses with hollowed bellies, and the idol of Yakarlash looming in the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. He stumbled through the fog-drenched streets as the village stirred to life behind curtained windows and warped doors, every warped glance and half-hidden face confirming what he now suspected. Wolfgart wasn't part of the Empire, whatever it'd been. The moment he slammed the door to his room, bolted it, and collapsed against the wall, a fresh wave of nausea overtook him. He retched bile into the rusted chamber pot. Blood laced the yellow fluid. His stomach spasmed with a sharp cramp, and for one horrifying moment, he thought he could feel something move inside him. The room swam. He pulled open his satchel with shaking hands and fumbled out his parchment, the official writ from Altdorf. The seal of the Emperor glared back at him, a symbol of order and law that now felt utterly meaningless. To collect long overdue imperial tithes from the fishing village of Wulfgart, Nordland province. Aldrich had read the words 100 times. He'd believed them, but now, with the image of the idol burned into his soul and the gutted villagers still fresh in his memory, he knew the truth was buried deeper. His eyes drifted to the thick, waterlogged ledger he had retrieved from the town hall. The ink was faded, the pages stuck together with mold and age, but buried between them were entries not meant to be seen. Marginal notes, written in a trembling hand. Doodles of symbols like those carved into walls, and one page near the back, torn, singed at the edges, written in red ink that had run down like veins. He read it, and the truth revealed itself like a knife to the gut. Wolfgard had been tithing long before the Empire ever knew of it. The word tithe had always been a misdirection, used to mask something older, deeper, and far more grotesque. While tax collectors and census takers were told of fish markets and salted exports, the true payment extracted by this village had never involved coin. It had been flesh. Page after page detailed rituals, sacrifices, offerings, to the Drowned Maw, long before the foundation of the Empire's rule in the region. There were references to the blood-slick tide, to the choosing of the young, and to the hollowing. Most chilling of all was the inventory, names, many foreign, many crossed out, dates matched with entries, travelers, soldiers, pilgrims, people who had come to Wulfgart and never left. The town had become a feeding ground. Aldrich's hands trembled as he turned another page. One entry was highlighted in a thick smear of ink and annotated in cramped handwriting. Tithe not received. Imperial collector delayed. The Drowned Maw grows hungry. More are needed. Bring the next. And beside it, in a different hand, was a name. Aldrich Margrave. He dropped the book. The floor groaned beneath him. The air thickened. He stood to leave, no longer thinking of duty, only of escape, but a sharp crack behind him made him freeze. A hinge creaked. The wardrobe door in the corner of the room shifted open an inch. His dagger was in hand instantly. He stepped forward, breath held, and flung it open. The stench hit first. Rotted seawater and curdled fat. Inside was a body, naked, soaked, pale, and bloated. The chest had been split open down the sternum and peeled aside, ribs snapped like crab legs. The cavity inside was empty, scoured clean, and something wet had been smeared along the spine, sigils in blood and mucus. Seaweed stuffed the mouth. One hand still clutched a silver locket. Inside was a miniature painting of a young boy. Aldrich stepped back, bile rising again, but before he could retch, a sound echoed through the wall. A low thump, then a dragging noise. He turned. Something was moving behind the far wall. Slowly. Wetly. He backed toward the door and yanked it open. The hallway was full of villagers. Not standing, not even walking, crawling. Dozens of them, naked and slick, writhing on all fours like boneless things. Their flesh was bloated and translucent, shot through with dark veins and moving bulges. Mouths opened and closed with no sound but the gurgle of water. Their eyes were gone, replaced by gill slits and membrane. Aldrich slammed the door shut and bolted it. The impact shuddered the frame. Hands scratched against the wood, nails pulling, scratching. Something thick slapped against the floor outside. A wail began, a keening note that vibrated the floorboards. A song, a command. Breathing, "He comes, he comes, he comes." The voice wasn't human. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the floor, the walls, the ceiling. It made his nose bleed and his vision blur. He had to flee. He kicked open the window and tumbled out into the cold fog. The ground slammed into him hard, but the adrenaline dulled the pain. Screams followed, wet gurgling growing louder behind him. He ran, back through the village, past the chapel, toward the cliff, but not to throw himself into the sea. No, now he knew. The sea was waiting. The flesh tithe was due. And Aldrich Margrave was next on the list. Chapter 8. Tentacles in the Fog. The fog rolled thicker than ever before, no longer mere weather, but a living thing, smothering the land like the breath of some vast sea beast. The lantern Aldrich held barely cut more than a few feet ahead, its flame flickering wildly in the cold, salt-choked air. Every shape beyond its reach twisted into looming, shifting silhouettes, barnacled rooftops bent like broken backs, skeletal trees clawing at the sky, and movement. Constant. Ceaseless. Wrong. In the corners of his vision. Aldrich's boots splashed through the muck of the village square. His breath came ragged, his heart a thunderous drumbeat beneath his ribs. The tithe of flesh. The shrine. The crawling villagers. He knew now, every step he took in this place had been engineered to lead him here. He hadn't stumbled into a cursed village. He had been brought. Then he heard them. Wet slaps, gurgled exhales, the squelching suction of flesh pulled free of stone. Shapes emerged from the mist ahead. 4 figures, crawling low to the ground, arms dragging behind them like discarded meat. One man's spine arched backwards grotesquely, his head twisted the wrong way, mouth wide open in an eternal scream. His lower jaw was gone, replaced by a ragged mess of cartilage and slime, and long tendril-like tongues spilled from the open gullet, twitching against the ground as if tasting it. Another figure, a woman whose belly hung open like a split sack of meat, rose unsteadily to her feet. Her arms were no longer arms. From her shoulders sprouted long, rubbery appendages, translucent in the lamplight, each ending in a ring of small, sharp-toothed mouths that clicked open and shut in anticipation. Aldrich stepped back. One of the creatures let out a noise. Not a scream, but a clicking sound, deep and rhythmic, like crabs tapping on stone. It was answered by another, and another from all around him. Behind, to the sides, even from above, on the rooftops, he realized with horror. They were closing in. He turned and ran. The village twisted underfoot. The road felt different, soft in places where it shouldn't be, as if the very earth was becoming flesh. He ducked beneath a fallen beam, tripped over a tangle of netting soaked in blood, and rolled to his feet just in time to see one of the abominations leap from a rooftop in front of him. It landed on all fours. Bones cracked. Its back split open down the spine, revealing a glistening mass of coiled tendrils that snapped outward, hungry. Two latched onto Aldrich's arm before he could pull away, and pain erupted, like red-hot needles burrowing into his skin. The creature's eyes, milky white and unblinking, bored into his as its mouth opened wide. Unhinging, a second mouth emerging from within, like a lamprey's, ringed with razored teeth. He drove his dagger into its throat. The blade sank in with a sickening crunch, and the creature howled, not in pain, but in something worse. Ecstasy. Its limbs convulsed. Brine exploded from the wound. Not blood, but high-pressure jets of salt water thick with black specks that hissed and steamed against Aldrich's skin. He twisted the blade and pushed, tearing the throat open wide. Something slithered free from the gash, a cluster of small tentacles, each with its own blinking eye, before going limp. Aldrich shoved the corpse aside and bolted again. From the left, a shriek, high and fluting, inhuman. A form lunged from the fog. This one was faster, too fast, a boy no more than 12, but his legs were bent in the wrong direction, and his feet had fused into flipper-like appendages. He barreled into Aldrich, knocking him into a stone wall. Sharp teeth tore into his shoulder, biting deep into flesh. Aldrich screamed, punching blindly. His fist met soft, wet flesh in a satisfying crunch. The boy reeled back, snarling, but didn't retreat. His jaw unhinged and stretched downward, flesh tearing at the corners of his mouth as something else began to emerge. A long, slick appendage with hooks on its underside. Aldrich grabbed a broken plank from the gutter, wrapped his hand around a nail protruding from it, and slammed it into the creature's face. The nail punched through an eye. A gout of brine exploded outward, and the creature wailed, stumbling back, hands clawing at its ruined face. Aldrich didn't wait. He ran toward the cliff path, the only place he could think to go that wasn't walled in by buildings and alleys. His vision blurred. His wounded shoulder throbbed with fire, and already his skin around the bite was growing hot, swollen. The fog thinned as he neared the sea. And there, silhouetted by the distant crashing surf, were more. Dozens of them. All turned toward him. Silent, waiting. He skidded to a halt. His lungs burned. The pain in his arm was now radiating down to his fingertips, an aching pulse that beat in time with his heart. From behind, the clatter of pursuit, the gurgled chants. He turned in a slow circle, trapped. And then, the ground beneath him moved. A ripple in the earth. The mud shuddered. Seaweed began to grow through cracks in the stone, coiling and twitching. A mouth yawned open where none had been, a pit lined with barnacled stone, out of which emerged a tentacle, thick as his torso, covered in hooked barbs and slick with mucus. It lashed out. Aldrich threw himself to the side as it crashed into the earth where he'd stood. sending a geyser of filth and broken stone into the air. Another came, and a third. He ran, again, blindly into the mist, this time back into the village, back into the nightmare. But even as he fled, he could feel it. Not fear, not just. With change. The wound on his shoulder pulsed, and beneath the skin something wriggled. Something new. Something hungry. Chapter 9. The Fisherman's Journal. The storm broke just before dawn, and for the first time in what felt like days, the sky wept fresh water instead of fog and brine. Rain lashed the rooftops of Wulfgart, cutting through the clinging sea mist like a cleansing blade. But Aldrich knew better. This storm was not salvation. It was memory. He had taken shelter in a boathouse, half collapsed and reeking of rot and fish guts, not far from the harbor's edge. His shoulder ached, the flesh inflamed and fevered, veins blackening in spiderweb patterns. He could feel something twitching just beneath the surface, like a parasite wriggling in a newly dug burrow, but he'd wrapped it tight, binding it with cloth soaked in wine, praying the crude bandage might delay the inevitable. The inside of the boathouse was a graveyard of nets and crab cages, the wood slick with slime. His lantern illuminated little more than coils of rusted chain, barrels crusted with salt, and stains he dared not investigate too closely. He sat there, soaked, breathing hard, until he noticed the trapdoor. It was tucked behind a pile of old bait buckets, hidden by thick ropes and a broken oar. The floor around it was dry, dusty, even, untouched by the moisture and filth of the upper structure. The iron ring was crusted with green salt crystals. With effort and a shoulder that screamed in protest, Aldrich heaved the hatch open and descended into the dark below. The air beneath was dry, too dry. He lit a second tallow stub and stepped into what had once been a storage cellar, but instead of salted fish or oars he found a cot, a rust-stained wash basin, and a desk made of scavenged driftwood. Candles had melted into grotesque wax idols in the corners. On the wall, pinned with rusted hooks, was a map of the coastline, marked with red lines, strange spirals, and a single, ominous word scrawled across the sea in thick charcoal. His wake. Aldrich's gaze fell to the journal lying open on the desk, its leather cover warped with age and salt. It was old, hand-bound, thick parchment, filled with densely packed entries in a jagged hand. The first pages were mundane. Catch reports, weather notes, complaints about taxes and net theft. But the tone changed abruptly 3 years in. The sea is wrong. The fish come up with no eyes, gills burst, flesh soft like jelly. Dorsal ridge breached the waves today. Not shark, not whale, something else, something vast. Then came the storm. Aldrich turned the pages slowly, the ink growing more erratic, the script slipping into madness. 3 nights ago the storm came, blackest I've seen. Sky turned purple-green, sea boiled. Lightning struck the shoals and the ground shook, not like thunder, like something beneath trying to rise. We found the first afterward, Tomas Rig, his mouth gone just a hole, bleeding salt, eyes white, skin smooth, like something peeled him. But he was breathing. Gods help us, he was breathing. Aldrich swallowed hard and read on. The author, unnamed, though the notes referenced a wife Lysa and a dog named Gutter, had witnessed the village's slow transformation, not at once, but over weeks. The sea began to hum at night, shapes moved just below the surface, and then in the fog. Men went missing, and returned changed, arms longer, mouths fuller of teeth. One girl had birthed a thing that wasn't a child, but a slick, eel-like creature with a human face that cried like a baby before crawling into the waves. The journal became a record of resistance. I tried to leave. The boats would split before we even reached the shoals. Salt in the water burns now, like acid. There is no leaving. Lysa has the dreams now. She whispers in her sleep, calls to something below. She doesn't see me anymore. Only him. I burned the nets. I smashed the idol the priest carved. He built a new one. This one made from fish bones. It bleeds when you cut it. Then came the entry that made Aldrich's blood run cold. They say he came from beneath the seabed, buried since the old times. The storm cracked the crust and let him rise. Not fully, not yet. He sleeps still, but dreams. And in those dreams he calls. The Drowned Maw. The Drowned Maw, the sleeper beneath. We give him flesh, and he gives us forever. Not life, but forever. They're not dying anymore, not really. Skin rots, bones twist, but they keep breathing. Even after drowning, even after the flesh is gone. I saw one of them gutted in the streets. It kept crawling, kept singing. Aldrich turned the last few pages in silence. The entries stopped being words, just spirals. Dozens of them, scrawled page after page, darker and darker, until the ink tore through the paper. Symbols, eyes, tentacles, until the final page. Written in letters so large they took up the whole parchment. He is in me now. Aldrich dropped the journal. He backed away from the desk, heart pounding, and almost tripped over the remains of a man crumpled in the corner. The skull was partially caved in. Salt crystals bloomed from the eye sockets. The flesh had long since withered away, but beneath the skin the bones bore growths, calcified tendrils, hook-like extensions curling from the spine. One hand was fused into a thick stalk, ending in barbs. The man had not died human. Rain pounded the floorboards above, and from the distance, somewhere in the deep fog, Aldrich heard it again. The sea was singing, and this time he understood the words. Chapter 10. The Drowned Ones. The rain had tapered off by dusk, but the fog remained, a wet, suffocating mass that clung to Aldrich's face like a burial shroud. Every breath tasted of salt and decay. The fever in his arm was worse now, the flesh around the bite hard and glistening, blistered with black nodules. Something inside the wound pulsed to its own rhythm, just out of sync with his heartbeat. He'd wrapped it tighter, stuffed his torn shirt in his mouth to stifle the scream, and pushed forward. His wandering brought him to the outskirts of Wulfgart, where the last structures stood before the cliffs began to drop into the roiling sea. Half hidden by the creeping fog, a large, squat barn loomed in the dim light, its frame warped with water damage, the roof sagging under the weight of years. One side had partially collapsed, but the rest remained intact, a silent relic of a time before madness claimed the village. It shoulda smelled of hay or livestock, but the stench was unmistakable. Rot. Not the dry, brittle scent of old death, but the wet, swollen reek of putrescence, bodies left to stew in brine and darkness. Aldrich approached the barn, each step sinking into the mud with a sickly squelch. The door hung half open. As he pushed it wider, the rusted hinges shrieked like tortured metal. Lantern raised, he stepped inside, and immediately recoiled. They were stacked like cordwood. Dozens of bodies, some naked, some clothed in rags, soaked dark with bodily fluids, piled 3 or 4 high, filling the center of the barn, packed into stalls and hung from beams with hooks through rib cages. Some had no eyes, their sockets stuffed with seaweed or stitched shut with wire. Others had mouths gaping wide, filled with barnacles or tiny grasping tentacles that twitched in the lantern light. But the worst were the ones that still moved. Not breathing. A hand twitched here, a jaw clenched there, a swollen foot kicked spasmodically. The sound of wet, bubbling breath echoed from somewhere within the pile. Aldrich's stomach lurched, but he forced himself forward, boots sloshing through filth that had no business being on dry land. He passed a corpse with its chest flayed open, revealing a nest of tiny eel-like creatures coiled within the ribcage, feeding. They hissed as he passed, retreating deeper into the cavity. Another body, a boy, no more than 15, had sprouted stalks from his spine that ended in closed, veined pods. One pod twitched, then bloomed, revealing a new eye inside. It blinked slowly and stared at Aldrich. The bodies weren't stored here. They were growing. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and his foot struck something soft. He turned. It had once been a man. Now, it was a bloated thing, its entire body engorged with water and something far worse. The skin was stretched to translucency. The face was a ruin, lips gone, exposing gumless teeth, nose collapsed into a gaping nasal hole that pulsed with each breath. A line of dark script had been carved into the forehead, illegible but glowing faintly with a sick green luminescence. Then its eyes snapped open. Like milky. Aldrich staggered backward. The man twitched once, then began to sing, a gurgled, rasping chant, no longer human speech, but the language of the drowned. Others answered. The pile began to shift. Corpses rolled aside, limbs stretching, joints cracking. One figure pulled itself free, its legs fused into a long serpentine tail. It dragged itself toward Aldrich, fingers leaving trails in the filth. From its abdomen, dozens of tiny mouths opened and closed, in chorus. Another emerged on all fours, its head split vertically from crown to jaw, revealing a mass of writhing cilia where a brain should be. The two halves clicked together like a shell, before it let out a shriek so loud it cracked the nearby glass pane. Aldrich turned and ran, slipping on the slime. Behind him, he could hear them, all of them, stirring, rising. Not with speed, but with relentless inevitability. The groaning of the dead, the splash of webbed feet, the clicking of mandibles, and the wet slap of tentacles against wood. Something latched onto his ankle. He hit the floor hard. The grip was strong, too strong. A hand, bloated and covered in barnacles, had caught him. He twisted around and saw its owner, a woman, her torso completely hollowed out, rib cage open like wings, with a mass of black worms writhing inside. Her face was blank. Her tongue, long and whip-like, slid from her mouth, coiling toward his face. Aldrich screamed and drove his dagger downward, straight into her eye. She hissed, but did not die. He stabbed again, and again. On the third strike, the skull cracked with a sickening pop, and black ichor sprayed across his face. The grip loosened. He kicked free and scrambled up. More of them were coming now. Some dragged themselves across the ground, leaving trails of steaming rot. Others lurched like puppets with too many strings, heads twisting at unnatural angles. One creature had no face at all, just a single vertical slit down the center of its skull, which opened like a blooming flower, revealing a tangle of tendrils and a central beak that snapped hungrily. Aldrich threw himself through the barn doors just as a clawed hand scraped down his back, tearing his coat. He ran into the storm, soaked in blood and slime, his ears echoing with the chorus of the drowned ones behind him. And still, over the shrieks and the chants, one phrase pulsed in his mind, unbidden but clear. Death is not the end, the sea remembers. Chapter 11. The Priest of the Maw. Aldrich staggered through the broken village like a hunted animal, soaked in blood and sweat, the fever in his shoulder now a wildfire consuming his entire left side. His skin felt loose like something beneath it squirmed and pushed outward. Every heartbeat brought a wave of nausea. His vision blurred in pulses. Yet he moved, driven by instinct, by terror, by the desperate need to understand why this was happening, and why he had been chosen. His path led him, inevitably, unnaturally, back to the chapel. The doors were wide open now, and the rotting seaweed that had once hung in sparse clumps across the altar now carpeted the floor, pulsing gently like breathing flesh. Salt crusted every surface. The air inside was damp and warm, heavy with incense and brine. The candlelight was dim but steady. Aldrich stepped cautiously down the center aisle, boots squelching in the fetid carpet, every nerve alight. Then he saw him. The priest. He stood at the altar like a figure from a fever dream, tall, rail-thin, and wrapped in ceremonial robes once embroidered with the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar. The symbol had been desecrated, defaced and stitched over with a spiral maw of black thread. The priest's hands were bare, fingers long and stained with ink and blood. His face was gaunt, lips cracked and darkened, skin sallow and pulled tight like wet parchment. His eyes had approached the purest-looking wood. One eye was gone, the socket filled with a cluster of writhing barnacles. The other, milky, luminous, glowed faintly in the candlelight. "Aldrich Margrave," the priest said softly, voice like waves lapping against a drowning man. "He spoke your name long before you arrived. The tides bring what must be brought." Aldrich's hand went to his dagger, though he knew it would do nothing here. "I'm leaving this place," he growled. "You will not stop me." The priest smiled. "Oh no, I wouldn't dare. You've come too far. You've been marked. You've heard him." Aldrich took a step closer. "What are you?" The priest gestured to the altar. Behind it, a pool of salt water had formed in a shallow depression, an unnatural thing, glimmering with motes of blue and green light. Shapes moved beneath the surface. Tentacles, eyes, fragments of faces. "I was once like you," the priest said, "a servant of the Empire, a man of Sigmar's cloth. But the sea is older, deeper. It knows more. It remembers. The gods of land speak of death and fire. Ykarlash offers eternity. By turning people into monsters," Aldrich spat. The priest chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Do you think the flesh matters? You cling to bones like they mean something, but the sea washes away weakness, replaces it with strength, purpose, immortality." He stepped forward. The hem of his robe dragged through the living seaweed without resistance. From beneath his sleeves his arms unfurled, not normal limbs anymore, but elongated, eel-like flesh covered in slick runes. One arm ended in a hand with too many fingers, the other in a fan of gill slits that pulsed as he breathed. "You've felt him," the priest said, voiced low and reverent, "in your dreams, in your blood. The change has begun." "I'm not becoming one of you," Aldrich snarled. "But you already are," the priest whispered. He extended one finger, one impossibly long bony finger, and pointed at Aldrich's shoulder. The pain flared, and Aldrich stumbled back with a cry. The skin split under the bandage, not from tearing, but from pushing. Something beneath the flesh rippled and stretched, and as he tore away the cloth he saw it, a mass of ridged, mucus-coated tissue swelling from his bicep, sprouting hair-fine filaments that twitched toward the sound of the priest's voice. "No?" he gasped. "Yes," the priest breathed. "You've tasted his gift. You've survived longer than any before. He wants you." Aldrich fell to his knees, bile rising in his throat. He tried to cut at the growth with his dagger, but it screamed. He screamed as pain exploded behind his eyes. The blade dropped from his numb fingers. The priest knelt before him. "You were not sent to collect coin," he murmured. "You were sent to be weighed, measured, judged, and you have been found worthy." "I'll kill you," Aldrich hissed. The priest leaned in close. His breath was hot and smelled of salt and decay. "You can kill me, but I will return. Just as he does. We do not die. We shed, like snakes, like waves. Behind the altar, the pool boiled. Something rose. A shape, not fully formed, not truly visible, but felt. A presence that bent reality around it like gravity. Its maw opened beneath the surface, and dozens of voices sang through Uldric's skull, in harmonies no mortal throat could make. Uldric screamed. He snatched his dagger and stabbed it into the priest's neck. Blood sprayed, not red, but dark green, thick and syrupy. The priest staggered, gurgling, but did not fall. His hands flailed, caught Uldric's throat with supernatural strength. His dying mouth opened wide, too wide, and a mass of tendrils burst forth, wrapping around Uldric's face, invading his nose, his mouth, his eyes. He slammed his head forward, breaking the priest's nose with a crunch of bone. The tentacles recoiled. Aldrich brought the dagger down again, into the priest's chest, into his gut, over and over, until the body collapsed in a pile of robes and ichor, twitching. The altar pool screamed. The candlelight died. And in the darkness Uldric heard a new voice, not the priest's, but something older, vast, grinning. The tides have chosen. The flesh is nearly ready. Chapter 12. Dreams of the Deep. Sleep found Uldrich not with peace, but with force, like a fist closing around his skull. He collapsed inside the shattered rectory beside the desecrated chapel, his body broken and soaked in priest's blood and filth. Every part of him screamed with fever. The growth in his shoulder had now spread down his side, sinewy cords of mutated flesh threading through his ribcage like roots breaking stone. His veins pulsed with a sickly green hue beneath paper-thin skin. He tried to stay awake, to resist the lull of unconsciousness, but the sea would not allow it. The dreams came, and they came hungry. He floated in blackness. Not water, not air. A medium between worlds, thick, warm, filled with whispers that brushed across his skin like dead hands. He could not move. He could only drift downward endlessly through the pressure of centuries. Below him, light. Not sunlight, not moonlight, but a pale, impossible glow, the kind of glow that bleeds from bone. He descended faster. The pressure tightened around his skull until his jaw cracked open. Bubbles exploded from his throat and dissolved into nothing. Then, shapes. Cities rose from the abyss, not made of stone or metal, but of bone and cartilage, of coral and scales. Alien towers spiraled impossibly into the void, growing like tumors from the ocean floor. Walls pulsed and flexed like lungs. Bridges writhed, reconfiguring themselves as they spanned vast trenches. Streets were rivers of gelatinous fluid, where translucent beings with too many limbs swam without moving. He passed over an amphitheater of flesh, where thousands knelt in perfect silence before an altar made of screaming mouths. Their faces were stretched tight, eyeless, lips sewn together, heads bowed. From the altar's center a gaping void yawned open, a sphincter of tentacles and jagged bone that pulsed with every beat of Aldric's mutated heart. He felt it before he saw it. Ychalash, the Drowned Maw. It rose slowly from the sea's trench like a leviathan made of everything wrong in creation. A mass of glistening, churning limbs and eyes, too large for his mind to comprehend. Its maw was a spiraling vortex of black teeth, wide enough to swallow a cathedral whole. Inside cities turned, ships, men, and monsters caught in a silent spiral toward oblivion. Emmett saw him, not with one eye, but with every eye. Each lidless orb turned and fixed upon him, unblinking, judging, devouring. In an instant, he knew what it was to be weighed not as a man, but as meat, something to be broken down and reassembled. Tendrils slithered up from the depths, cold, wet, stronger than iron, They wrapped around his limbs, pulled him down. He screamed, bubbles pouring from his throat, but no sound escaped, only a low chant that he somehow recognized. The flesh serves, the soul drowns, the tide consumes. The tendrils dragged him into the god's mouth. He passed teeth the size of towers, rows and rows, serrated, grinding against each other with the patience of eternity. They did not bite. They shaved. Flesh peeled away from him in delicate layers, sliced into ribbons, each strip vanishing into the god's gullet with a satisfied slurp. His skin, muscles, nerves, all offered lovingly, worshipfully, into the churning machinery of transformation. And still, he lived. Still, he saw. Within the maw, a new city awaited, a city made of him, towers grown from his bones, streets paved with his flesh, bells that rang with the sound of his heartbeat. And beneath it all, millions more, others who had drowned, devoured, changed, singing through mouths that were not their own. Aldrich saw his face in all of them. He screamed again. He awoke mid-scream. His throat was raw. His tongue had split in two. Thin filaments writhed between his teeth, tasting the air. His hands shook violently. His fingernails had blackened, cracked open, and thin, glassy claws were beginning to grow beneath. He vomited onto the floor of the rectory, water and bile and small things that twitched before dying. The storm had returned outside. The sea raged. Inside, Aldrich wept, because part of him had not come back. Part of him still floated in that city, below the waves, and part of him loved it. Chapter 13. The Last Sanity. The lighthouse rose above Wulfgard like a skeletal finger pointing an accusation at the gods. Once a proud stone tower that guarded the treacherous northern coast, it was now a ruin. Its beacon dark for years, the upper railing rusted through, its spiral staircase choked with lichen, salt, and the detritus of a dying village. But unlike the rest of Wulfgard, it did not hum with the sick energy of Yekarlash. No tentacled growths crept along its walls. No fish-ate villagers skulked near its base. It stood apart. That was why Aldrich went there. His mind teetered on the edge of collapse. Dreams and waking reality bled into each other now. He often saw the city beneath the waves, even when his eyes were open. His mouth constantly tasted salt. The wound on his shoulder had sealed itself, not healed, with a translucent membrane that flexed like gills. He had ceased trying to tear it away. The flesh underneath no longer belonged to him. He entered the lighthouse through a side door, torn off its hinges, stepping into a dark chamber filled with cracked glass lenses and the remnants of ancient oil lamps. A spiral staircase climbed upward in twisting shadows. He ascended slowly, using a rusted railing to steady himself. Every muscle ached. His breath came in wheezes and his blood itched as if crawling. Halfway up, he heard the sobbing. He paused, dagger in hand, and listened. Not the wet gurgling of the drowned ones. Not the droning of sea chants. Just a child sobbing. He climbed the rest of the way, every step sending echoes down the hollow shaft. At the top, where the sea light once shone, he found the girl. She was no older than 10, barely a child. She sat in the corner of the circular lantern room, curled beneath a canvas tarp, clutching a rusted iron lantern to her chest. Her blonde hair was matted with grime and salt, and her face was thin with hunger. Her eyes were blue, wide, and very human, mostly. Aldrich stepped into the light, weapon lowered. "I'm not one of them," he said. She flinched, but didn't scream. "Who do I know you're not lying?" she whispered, voice cracked from thirst. "They lie. They can sound like people." He held out his hand. "If I was like them, you'd already be screaming. Or bleeding." She hesitated, then nodded. "You're changing," she said. "But you're still you." "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling. "Elspeth." She looked at him. Really looked. Her gaze lingered on his arm, on the wet sheen of unnatural tissue stretching beneath his coat. "You're changing like my father did," she whispered. Aldrich didn't answer. He didn't need to. She stood, slowly, and hobbled toward a locked chest set into the wall. Her leg dragged as she walked. With effort she opened the lid and pulled out a crumpled journal, a half-loaf of stale bread, and a small vial of clear fluid. "Found this here," she said. "Been hiding since they took my family. I saw what happened. They drowned my mother in the bay. But she didn't stay drowned." Aldrich took the vial. It smelled faintly of alchemical tincture, possibly something from Altdorf, long expired. Still, it burned pleasantly down his throat. He sat back, the fire in his chest momentarily replaced by clarity. "We have to leave," she said, "before the final calling. They gather when the black tide comes. The maw wakes fully. All the drowned will rise." He nodded, understanding, but something in her tone made his stomach knot. Then he saw her leg. Not her foot, the whole leg. From the knee down, it wasn't flesh anymore. Not exactly. It shimmered under the thin cloth of her dress. Scales, not skin. Pale opalescent, webbed. Her toes had fused. Her shin pulsed faintly, as if it contained something. "Moving." She caught his stare. "I know," she whispered, tears brimming. "It started after I touched the tide pool. I thought it was just a sting, but then the dreams came. The singing. My bones hurt. Sometimes I can't feel my foot. Sometimes I feel the sea instead." Aldrich said nothing. The child, this fragile, broken thing, had resisted longer than most adults. Longer than he had. "Can you still run?" he asked. She nodded, silent. "Then we go tonight." They spent the hours before nightfall preparing. Aldrich scavenged a harpoon from the lower level and splinted Elsbeth's leg with wood and rope. He rationed the bread and shared the last of his water. Her voice shook as she described what she'd seen. The villagers chanting in the streets, mutilating themselves in tribute. The priest, before his transformation. The barn of corpses. All things Aldrich knew too well now. As the sun dipped low behind the clouds, the girl lit a small lantern and placed it on the ledge. "They hate the light," she whispered. "Real light. They hide from it. And the beacon? Broken. But there's a crystal in the lens. If we could fix it, maybe." She trailed off. They both knew it was fantasy. The real plan was simple. Get to the cliffs, climb down, steal a skiff if any remained, push off into the night, and pray the tide took them far enough before the drowned ones noticed. But the chanting had already begun. Far below, rising through the fog like the voice of the sea itself, came the low, droning hymn. "Walls, he calls, he calls." Aldrich looked to Elsbeth, whose eyes rolled back slightly for just a moment before she blinked and clenched her fists. "Still here," she muttered. "Still me." Aldrich felt the same pull inside him. The pulse, the rhythm. His shoulder itched, a thin tendril flexed under the skin of his neck, and he bit his tongue hard enough to draw blood. They were both running out of time. But for now, for one last breath, they were together. Two souls adrift in a drowning world, clinging to the last scraps of humanity. The last sanity. Chapter 14. Purging Light. The sky was a solid lid of storm clouds, churning above Wulfgart like the writhing guts of some titanic beast. Thunder cracked in jagged pulses over the roiling sea, and wind screamed through broken windows and dead streets. The village below the lighthouse seethed with movement, black shapes shuffling through the fog, chanting in that vile, gurgled tongue. The ground trembled with unnatural resonance. Somewhere out in the waves, something vast was stirring. And above it all, in the rotting crown of the old lighthouse, Eldrick and Elsbeth stood before the shattered beacon. Their only hope. "It won't work," Aldrich hissed as he studied the rusted mechanism. "The gears are fused. No oil, no flame. It's dead." "No," Elsbeth whispered, pointing to the lens at the center of the beacon. "It's not dead." The lens was ancient, far older than the iron fittings that surrounded it, a perfect orb of blue glass, etched with sigils that pulsed faintly in the dark. When Aldrich touched it, his fingertips recoiled from a cold that felt deeper than winter, deeper than time, as though the lens were not glass but ice pulled from the sea's abyss. He looked down at Elspeth. Her eyes were glazed, lips trembling. "This was here before the Maw," she said, "before Wulfgart. It was made in Manann's name, the sea god, the true sea god. It burns them, the drowned. It burns their souls." Outside, the chanting swelled, louder now, unbearable, a sonic blasphemy crawling up the lighthouse walls like worms beneath skin. Aldrich gritted his teeth and began to work. The mechanism screamed as he forced them to move. He jammed a rusted crank into place, poured every drop of oil left in the ancient cistern into the burner, and prayed. Elsbeth climbed to the highest point in the chamber, pulled a shutter aside, and held the crystal steady as Aldrich struck steel to flint over and over. Nothing. Spark. Spark. Nothing. Then fire. A sudden, blinding blue-white flame roared to life, swallowing the lens with holy luminance. The runes etched into its glass ignited, glowing with sacred fire not of this world. The entire tower shook. A bell-like tone rang out, not from the flame, but from the lens itself, resonating through every stone and bone in the tower. Elspeth screamed, holding her ears, as the relic pulsed with radiant fury. The light lashed out across the sea. Below, Wolfgart erupted in agony. The light did not just illuminate, it seared. It pierced the fog like a blade and struck the streets like lightning. Every creature caught in its path writhed and howled. The mutated villagers screamed as steam hissed from their flesh. Barnacles burst from skin, tentacles shriveled and fell away. One man's head, covered in dozens of tiny eyes, imploded, his brain boiling out through ruptured sockets. A woman with gills split across her chest, staggered into the open, arms raised to the beacon, and her body cracked like overcooked meat, bones rupturing outward in violent spasms. They tried to flee, but the light followed. It hunted them. Every abomination born of Yokar Lash's corruption burned. Every drowned one collapsed into a shrieking mass of frothing gore. The barn of corpses, hidden deep in the village, erupted, the mutated dead inside screaming as the light found them through rotted slats and shattered beams. The fog recoiled, vaporizing into nothing as the light consumed it. Aldrich stood transfixed at the top of the tower, bathed in blue light. His shoulders screamed, the thing inside him writhing, burrowing, trying to flee his flesh. He screamed in return, dropping to his knees, clutching his side as the membrane that had sealed his wound burst. From it slithered a mass of tendrils, translucent and veined with black. But the light touched them, and they ignited. The parasite shrieked in a language beyond pain, flailing as it tried to crawl back inside. Aldrich seized a shard of broken glass, teeth clenched and sliced deep into the wound. Blood sprayed. The tendrils flailed, and he ripped it out. A slick, leech-like creature 3 feet long flopped to the floor, its many mouths snapping blindly. Aldrich drove his heel down, once, twice, crunch, until it was nothing but twitching pulp. Elsbeth screamed. He turned, just in time to see her collapse. She had dropped the lens, falling to her knees, clutching her stomach. Her leg was boiling, the scaled flesh sloughing off in steaming hunks. Her eyes rolled back, mouth open in a silent scream. "No, no, no, no!" Aldrich rushed to her side. She seized, bones cracking, mouth foaming. Then suddenly it stopped. The light pulsed again, once, like a heartbeat, and held. Elsbeth gasped. Her leg, still twisted, still scarred, but no longer writhing. She was breathing. Still her. Still human. Then came the sound. From the sea. A great groan, like the cracking of an ice shelf, like the scream of a dying god. Aldrich and Elsbeth turned toward the horizon and saw the truth. Where the light struck the ocean, it parted the waves and revealed what lay beneath. A trench, vast, deep, ancient, and from it a shape rose. Miles wide. Impossible. Its form was not entirely visible, too large, too wrong, but the maw could be seen, spiraling, endless. Ringed with teeth larger than towers, dozens of massive eyes, each the size of a ship, turned skyward. Tentacles the length of rivers writhed just beneath the waves. Ychalash. The drowned maw. The god stirred in its slumber and screamed, but the light held firm. Its beam struck the god's skin, and the sea boiled. The trench trembled, and then, with a sound like a world being torn in half, the beast sank, ripped back into the depths by unseen forces, its flesh melting beneath the light of the true sea god. Annan's flame. The trench collapsed, and the waves closed. The chanting stopped. The wind died, and silence fell over Wulfgart for the first time in a century. Chapter 15. The tide comes in. The light died at midnight. One moment it bathed the coast in blue, burning corruption from earth and flesh. The next, the beacon shuddered. The sacred lens cracked down its center with a scream like metal torn from bone, and darkness flooded the tower like a tide of oil. Aldrich and Elsbeth watched helplessly as the last flame flickered and vanished, leaving only the roaring wind and the distant groan of the deep. Then the storm arrived. Not a storm of this world. The sea turned black, not from night, but from something ancient rising to the surface. The sky above Wulfgart split open like a rotted belly, clouds boiling in spirals, streaked with pulses of bioluminescent green. Lightning danced across the heavens in silence, illuminating the cliffs with bursts of sickly light that made the world appear painted in corpse hues. Thunder never followed, only the chanting. It rose once more, louder than ever, from the village below, a bellowing, shuddering chorus of mutated throats, voices fused with gills, mouths lined with teeth not made for human speech. They sang in rhythm with the storm, in reverence of what was coming. Aldrich and Elsbeth descended the tower, the girl limping on her twisted leg, the man clutching his side, still bleeding from where he'd torn the parasite free. They moved through a town transformed. The buildings buckled and cracked. The streets sled salt water. Seaweed slithered through the cobblestones like veins beneath the skin of a corpse. And in the square, the ritual had begun. When they saw the priest again, though Eldrick had crushed his throat and split him open, the priest stood tall, flanked by creatures that had once been villagers, now bloated things of bone and scale. His body was stitched together with muscle that pulsed visibly, and where his face once was, there now stretched a wide, circular mouth, rimmed with gill-like tendrils, constantly opening and closing as it sang. He held aloft a great shard of obsidian coral, jagged and weeping black ichor. Around him the drowned ones knelt, cutting symbols into their own chests, offering flesh freely. Some tore off fingers. One man plucked out his own eye and held it skyward like a fruit to be devoured. Elsbeth gasped as a woman, naked and foaming at the mouth, slit her stomach wide with a knife carved from whale tooth. Her intestines fell out like eels, squirming against the stones. Still she sang, still she offered. Scrollness Dela, Elsbeth Dela's elderly wife. They were rumored to have married as they sang. The priest slammed the coral shard into the ground. A great tremor passed through the earth. The sea responded. The tide rushed in. Not in gentle waves, but in a wall tens of feet high, surging over the docks and crashing into the village with the sound of temples collapsing. Homes vanished, piers splintered. The bodies of the sacrificed were swept into the current, spinning and dancing in the foam like marionettes on strings. But they did not drown. They rose. Their chests split open. From their ribs bloomed fan-like fronds of flesh, and their backs arched as tentacles sprouted where spines should be. Their eyes turned milky white, then were replaced by clusters of barnacles that blinked in unison. And from the ocean it came. A shadow in the water. Not fully risen, but rising. An outline of impossible scale, a head like a nautilus shell covered in spires, a body composed not of singular form, but many shifting and folding in upon themselves, mouths within mouths, tendrils thick as towers, and eyes, dozens, hundreds, opening all at once, glistening like opals, staring across every horizon. Ikarash stirred. The drowned maw had awakened. Aldrich and Elsbeth watched from the cathedral steps as the priest began his final act. He opened his arms wide. The coral shard burned with an inner light. The chant reached its crescendo. Voices layered upon voices, as if the entire ocean now sang through the lungs of the villagers. The priest looked to the sky. "We give! We give! We give!" And they did. One by one, the villagers willingly threw themselves into the abyss. They ran toward the sea in droves, fathers, mothers, children, screaming, laughing, bleeding. As they hit the water, their bodies were consumed, not swallowed whole, but dismantled, peeled apart like fruit skins and drawn downward in writhing ribbons, offered piece by piece to the awakening God. Their souls screamed in unison, drawn into that churning darkness. Elsbeth fell to her knees. Baldric pulled her back, gripping her with the last of his strength. "We run," he rasped. "Now." "But there's nowhere to go," she whimpered. "Then we run anyway." Behind them, the sea boiled. Lightning flashed, and the tide came in. Chapter 16. Flight through the abyss. The ground quaked as the sea swallowed Wulfgart. What had once been crooked alleys and rotting buildings now cracked, warped, and bent under forces not of this world. The village twisted like flesh in agony, roads writhing into spirals, rooftops crumpling as if under a great weight. Tidewaters surged through every street, not just with water, but with life. Twisted, wriggling, alien life. Baldric pulled Elsbeth through knee-high water, the current biting at their legs with freezing teeth. Above, the clouds churned into an eye that stretched across the sky, and from its center a pale green light burned through the storm, a spotlight from the heavens, casting long shadows of things writhing in the tide. The singing had not stopped. It had only changed, deepened, become layered. It now pulsed like a heartbeat, as if the entire world breathed with one massive cyclopean lung, and with every beat, the village changed more. Wood rotted instantly, stone melted into slime. Chimneys sprouted tendrils that waved in the windless air, releasing spores that sizzled when they touched flesh. Trees grew upside down, their roots reaching into the sky like clawed fingers. Walls bled, windows wept tears of salt. Behind them came the pursuit. They were the villagers no longer. They were things born from man, but touched by the abyss, reshaped in his image. The first that emerged from the flooded square was a creature that might have once been a woman, now fused with a rotting whale skull. Her arms were flukes. Her lower half dragged a trail of intestine and snapping lamprey mouths. She shrieked and slithered, leaving behind a trail of slick brine and twitching eggs that burst open to spill chittering crab-like young. Aldrich turned a corner, only to find the road had fallen away, no longer stone but a chasm, pulsing and glistening, filled with black water and movement. Tentacles as thick as ships roamed the depths below, rising now and then to lash at the sides, dragging entire buildings into the dark. "Back!" he shouted, hauling Elsbeth as she nearly tumbled over the edge. From behind, a creature leapt. No legs, only an immense bloated chest and massive arms that beat like flippers. It smashed into the wall beside them, sending a spray of debris and seawater into the air. Its face was a perfect, smooth oval of white skin, with a mouth that suddenly tore open from scalp to chin, revealing rows of inward-facing teeth. Aldrich didn't hesitate. He drove a rusted harpoon into the thing's neck. It screamed, not in pain, but in ecstasy, a wail that rose into a guttural hymn. Its blood was white and thick like clotted milk. As it writhed, Aldrich kicked it over the edge, watching it vanish into the chasm below. More followed. One crawled along the ceiling above them, a thing of sinew and eye stalks, its head little more than a cluster of barnacles with leech mouths. Another burst from beneath the surface of the tide, its back armored in crab shell, legs twitching in all directions, pincers snapping madly as it screeched, and launched itself toward Elsbeth. Aldrich grabbed her and rolled, barely missing its strike. The creature snapped at them from behind, and Aldrich slashed across its face with the harpoon blade. The impact shattered one of its eyes. It howled and fell back into the water. "We can't outrun them," Elsbeth cried. "We don't need to," Aldrich shouted back. "We just have to get to the cliffs." The cliffs, their only chance. A skiff might remain. If not, they would jump. Better to drown in clean water than to become what Wulfgart now birthed. The sky above split again, and from it rained not water, but fish, alive, twitching, gasping, each misshapen, mutated, many with faces eerily human. They splattered across the street, flopping grotesquely, some bursting on impact with wet cracks and sprays of acid-green fluid. Everywhere, the village groaned, as if it too suffered under the weight of Ykalish's awakening. A tower crumbled behind them, revealing a vast tentacle rooted deep into the ground, curling around the structure like a parasite. It pulled, drawing the tower down into the earth like meat down a gullet. They climbed over rubble, ducked under hanging entrails of what might have once been townsfolk, now dangling from the eaves in prayerful poses, mouths still whispering incoherently as they slowly decayed alive. Ahead, the final road to the cliffs, and standing in their path, a guardian. It stood 12 feet tall, a mass of chitin, muscle, and coral. Its legs were pillars of shell and flesh, its arms ended in spiraling claws like augers. Its face bore no eyes, only one massive vertical mouth that screamed open to reveal concentric rings of teeth and a singular twitching tongue with a face on it, a face that smiled with Aldrich's own features. It spoke with his voice. "Return. The tide accepts you." Aldrich raised the harpoon. "Get back," he ordered Elspeth. Then he charged. The thing lunged, one claw smashing into the road, sending shrapnel into Aldrich's side. He ignored the pain, slamming the harpoon upward into the beast's jaw. It roared, spinning and hurling him back into the wall with a bone-snapping crunch. It turned for Elspeth. Aldrich, coughing blood, saw her raise a broken lantern. The last flame they had. She threw it. The oil-soaked creature ignited. Fire, pure and violent, roared across its body. It screamed, this time in true agony. The flames climbed into its mouth, into the thing wearing Aldrich's face, and the head exploded in a wet burst of fire and gore. The path was open. Aldrich dragged himself to his feet, Elsbeth supporting him now, and together they sprinted for the cliffs as the village collapsed behind them. Tentacles burst from the ground. Buildings folded into the sea. The eye in the sky widened. Water surged forward, reaching for them. But the cliff's edge, there, they didn't stop. They leapt, and behind them, Wulfgart was devoured. Chapter 17. The Black Salt Tower. The skiff slammed into the rocks below the cliffs with a teeth-rattling crack. Aldrich and Elsbeth were flung into the surf, dragged and pounded by freezing water that seemed to pull in all directions at once. Salt invaded every orifice. The sea roared with fury, its current no longer the will of wind and moon, but the wrath of something sentient, something hungry. Aldrich surfaced first, blood in his mouth, the wound on his side gaping and raw. Through a film of red, he saw Elsbeth bobbing nearby, her tiny hands clawing at the side of the jagged outcrop. He surged toward her, wrapped one arm around her waist, and together they fought their way onto the rocks. Above them loomed the Black Salt Tower. Once a watchtower of stone and empire steel, it had been consumed by something older, covered entirely in barnacles, coral blooms, and ropes of kelp that dripped with foul ichor. The structure pulsed like an organ, alive with breath and memory, and from its summit a rift had torn open in the sky, a spiraling wound in reality that bled seawater, stars, and things that should never see light. The eye of Yakarlash. He'd looked down upon the world, unblinking. "We have to stop it," Elsbeth coughed, her leg twitching with every step. "He's here. He's inside the tower." They climbed. The stairs were no longer stairs. They were flesh, slippery ridges of sinew and cartilage that flexed underfoot, squelching with every step. The walls were tight, slick with brine, and coated in growths that pulsed when touched. Eyes opened in the crevices. Some watched silently. Others whispered in voices that mimicked Aldrich's own thoughts, telling him to lie down, to accept, to let the transformation finish. He pressed on. At the top, they emerged into a platform open to the void above. The air here was not air, it was pressure, immense and crushing, a downward force that pressed against the soul. The rift pulsed in the sky directly overhead, a massive spiral of water and darkness filled with silhouettes of swimming horrors, some the size of castles, others serpentine and endless. And there, at the center of the platform, stood the high acolyte. His body was no longer human. It had grown tall and thin, stretched beyond mortal form. His flesh had hardened into plates of black coral, veined with glowing green ichor. Tentacles spilled from his chest like a beard. His face had no features now, just a slit in the center of his skull, constantly dripping seawater that hissed as it hit the stone. In his hands he held the heart of the maw, a pulsating orb of translucent matter that seemed to contain an entire ocean within it. Storms raged inside. Leviathans circled. A spiral of mouths opened in the center, whispering blasphemies in tongues older than time. The acolyte raised the heart toward the rift. Aldrich stepped forward, harpoon in hand. "No further," he rasped. The acolyte turned slowly. "Ah, the Empire's final coin," he said in a voice layered with the echoes of the drowned. "You should be grateful. You are being made new." "I've seen your gifts." Aldrich spat. "I've killed what you've made." The acolyte grinned with a mouth that split his chest open. "You've seen birth pangs. Not the child, not the glory. You mistake transcendence for corruption." Behind him, the rift widened. Tendrils of darkness poured through, touching the tower and leaving trails of black salt that hissed and steamed. Screaming faces formed in the air, swallowed by the spiral. A wave of pressure crashed into Aldrich and Elsbeth, forcing them to their knees. The heart of the maw rose higher. Elsbeth screamed and charged. The acolyte moved faster than should be possible, backhanding her with a tendril-thick arm. Bone cracked as she flew across the platform, striking the railing with a wet thud. "No!" Aldrich roared. He lunged. The harpoon struck the acolyte's side, but did not pierce, only sank into flesh that folded and absorbed the blade. A dozen tentacles snapped forward, wrapping around Aldrich's limbs, lifting him into the air. The acolyte brought him close, face to writhing face. "You are his," he hissed. "You always were." Aldrich's shoulders split again, the sealed wound reopening in a spray of brine. Something reached out from within him, a tendril, wet and twitching, reaching for the heart. "No," Aldrich growled through clenched teeth. "Not his." He drove the broken haft of the harpoon into his own side, through the tendril. It severed with a shriek that echoed into the rift. The acolyte reared back in surprise. Aldrich hit the platform hard. Elsbeth, broken and bleeding, crawled toward the heart. "We end it," she whispered. She pulled from her belt the last lantern, the flame blessed by Menan. "Sestia, Menan." "Together," she whispered. Aldrich grabbed it, teeth bloodied, vision doubling. He hurled the flame into the hut. The reaction was immediate. The heart screamed. The rift above convulsed. The acolyte shrieked in agony as cracks tore through his armor, ichor spraying in all directions. The heart of the maw exploded, releasing a shock wave that tore the tower's surface open, and the rift collapsed in on itself, pulling everything upward: water, air, light, the acolyte's body. He screamed as he was dragged into the void, limbs flailing, mouth open in endless despair. Ulrich grabbed Elsbeth and threw them both behind a coral pillar as the world collapsed around them. The last thing he saw before the rift sealed was the eye of Yakarlash, gazing down with a flicker of disappointment. And then silence. Chapter 18. Blood for the tithe. The black salt tower groaned beneath their feet as the rift tried to close. Ragged and unfinished, its edge still twitching like an open wound in the sky. The vortex had collapsed inward, but the scar remained, a jagged tear in the fabric of reality, leaking brine, starlight, and low murmurs from the abyss. The world above still shimmered with madness. Aldrich lay on the ground, staring up at the bleeding sky, his hand crushed, his ribs shattered, his flesh crawling with heat as the infection pulsed through his veins like living fire. He turned his head toward Elsbeth. She was dying. Her leg had split along the shin, not from injury, but from growth, the scaled flesh cracking open to reveal gill-like vents, thin membranes fluttering with each breath. Her lips were blue, her face pale. Blood pooled beneath her where she had fallen from the acolyte's blow. "No," Aldrich wheezed, dragging himself across the shattered floor. "Not like this." The platform around them was in ruins. One half of the tower had collapsed into the sea below, and salt water surged against the stone like a heartbeat. Fragments of the acolyte's body still twitched where they had landed, but his voice was silent now. Only the rift remained, and it pulsed with hunger. He crawled toward it, dragging himself with one ruined arm, the other too numb to move. The voice came again, not heard, but felt, vibrating his bones, his blood, his very thoughts. The tithe must be paid. The air turned heavy. The pressure built again. Beneath the stone tendrils began to emerge, long, black, and wet. Not hostile, not violent. Expectant. He turned back to Elsbeth. She had opened her eyes. "Aldrich," she whispered, voice fragile as cracked glass. "It's still open." I know. You have to. Finish. He reached her. His fingers brushed her hand. It was cold. Then came the understanding. The rift needed blood, not random death, not slaughter. A sacrifice. A soul willingly given, one touched by the sea's corruption, tainted but not yet claimed. One who straddled the line between man and something else. Aldrich. Or at least both. He sat back, gasping, his body shaking as a tendril rose from his chest, his own chest. It slivered from the still-healing wound, slick with mucus, twitching in anticipation. His mouth tasted salt. His left eye burned. He knew without looking that it had turned pale, bulging, inhuman. He was becoming one of them. But not yet. Not completely. He had a choice. "I can do it," Elsbeth whispered. "I'm already almost gone." "No." His voice broke. "You're just a child." Her eyes filled with tears. "So were the others." She looked at him, then to the rift. "But you're strong. You can live. You can get out." Aldrich looked down at the harpoon, broken but still sharp at one end. Blood crusted its haft. Around them the tendrils began to coil, sensing decision. A low humming filled the air, the rift's heartbeat growing faster. Hungry. Impatient. He gritted his teeth. He rose. And he stood, shaking, bleeding, coughing chunks of brine, but standing. "Elspeth," he said, "close your eyes." "No." She did. He raised the harpoon. He trembled in his hand. The tendril from his chest twitched violently. His skin burned. The mutations surged, boiling under the surface. Scales erupted along his ribs. His arm cracked backward at the elbow. He screamed, but he held. He looked at her one last time. Then he turned the harpoon inward, toward himself. He drove it deep into his own gut. The rift exploded in light. Blood sprayed across the altar stone in a geyser of red and green. His legs buckled. He fell to his knees, then forward, his chest splitting open as the tendril lashed out, writhing, thrashing, and was pulled into the wound in the sky. The rift devoured it. The light turned to fire. Every part of Aldrich burned. He screamed as the sea inside him boiled away, as the scales blackened, flaked off, as his bones shattered and regrew and shattered again. His eye burst in a pop of white fluid. His heart faltered. The tower shook. The sky screamed. And then, silence. The rift closed. The tendrils vanished. The storm died. Aldrich collapsed beside Elsbeth, barely breathing. His last thought, before the blackness claimed him, was of the sea receding and a girl, still human, clutching his hand. Chapter 19. Drowning in Madness. The world ended in silence. No trumpets, no screams, no prayers. Only the slow, sucking hiss of the sea-consuming stone, the heavy breath of something ancient rising, and the beating of one last fractured heart against a ruined ribcage. Aldrich's sacrifice had closed the rift, but not in time. The sea had already come. From every direction it surged in unnatural defiance of gravity and terrain, pouring through cliffs and forests, rising higher than the tallest tower. It swallowed Wulfgardt's corpse in a single tidal exhalation, dragging buildings, trees, and flesh into its churning, frothing mouth. The black salt tower was the last to go. As the final wave crested over the stone parapets, the sky darkened into pitch, and thunder rumbled not from clouds, but from beneath. A single crack split the heavens, not lightning, but revelation. And from the black belly of the sea, he rose. The Karlash, the Drowned Maw. The god came not as a being, but as a cataclysm, a mass so vast, so incomprehensible that the sky itself bent around his arrival. His flesh was not flesh, but a city of living mouths, speaking in dead languages, each one chewing on prophecy, exhaling truths no mind could hold. Dozens of tendrils, miles long, whipped into the clouds, each one barbed, barnacled, and pulsing with the color of drowning. Some ended in eyes, great unblinking orbs the size of warships, each filled with swirling galaxies. Others ended in faces, human faces, screaming, smiling, weeping, plucked from memory, still attached to the raw ends of nerve and sinew. His body was a roiling sea of formless form, a titan wrapped in dreams and rot. Fish-like scales bloomed and peeled, only to be replaced by coral and cancer. Limbs unfolded endlessly, dragging behind them great ropes of sacrificial offerings. Torn corpses still twitching with residual life, eyes rolled upward, mouths whispering the same refrain. Erg comes. He comes. He comes. The water boiled. The sky bled. Aldrich, barely alive, clutched the edge of the tower ruins, eyes wide with horror and awe. Every part of him screamed, and not from pain, but from recognition. This was no god of storms or death. This was origin. This was the first predator, the first hunger, the first lie. See everything. Yakarlash had no singular form, because he was all of them. Every drowned man, every sailor's last breath, every madness whispered in sleep, every deep-sea terror imagined in the mind of a desperate, dying soul. He was the sea, made sentient and cruel. His arrival unmade the world. The tide surged again, not forward but inward, dragging Wulfgard's remains into his mass. Streets folded like paper, trees twisted into knots of bone. The dead were plucked from the mud and fused into the god body, their screams now part of the ocean's song. The prophecy bloomed. From his central maw, spiraling endlessly inward, a voice emerged. It was not a roar. It was thought made sound, a language heard in dreams. In 1,000 voices at once, the land shall be washed, the flesh shall be rewritten, the tide shall never recede. The empire shall drown in its arrogance. Aldrich screamed, clutching his ears, blood pouring from his nose, his mutated shoulder bubbling with new growth. His own flesh remembered the chant, long before his mind did. Beside him, Elsbeth rose. She stood unaided now, the mutation in her leg pulsing but stable. Her eyes glowed with a soft, bioluminescent hue. She stared up at the god, not in horror, but in eerie, terrible understanding. "He's inside everything now," she whispered, "even the land, the water, us." "Then we fight," Aldrich rasped. "No," she said, gently. "We end it." She stepped forward onto the shattered edge of the tower, held her arms wide, and sang. It was not a song of the drowned. It was a song of the sea before the drowning. Words spoken in the tongue of Manan, hidden in choral scripts long burned from mortal tomes. Yakarlash stopped, feeling himself moving. For the first time since his emergence, the god paused. All his mouths went silent, and the water held still. Aldrich stared, realizing what she was doing. She wasn't stopping him. She was calling him back, offering herself a new tithe. The sea erupted. Tentacles surged forth, not in rage, but reverence. They encircled her, wrapped gently around her arms, her torso. They pulled her upward, not like prey, but like a daughter returning home. Aldrich tried to rise, to stop her, but his legs gave way. His vision blurred. She turned once to look at him. She smiled. Then she was gone, swallowed by the god. And Yakarlash sank. The sea turned black, the sky closed, the silence returned, not empty, but sated. And all that remained of Wulfgart was salt. Chapter 20. The Tithe continues. The sea gave him back, not with reverence nor disgust, but with indifference, like waste expelled by a creature too vast to notice what it swallowed. Uldric awoke on a stretch of grey sand far south of Wulfgart, where no birds called and no waves broke. The tide was out, unnaturally far, revealing black mud cracked like parched skin and littered with bones of sea creatures that had never lived. The wind was still, the air was heavy, the world had changed. So had he. His first breath tasted of rot and salt. His skin was cold, pallid, covered in thin webbing of barnacle-pocked tissue that flexed with the tide's rhythm. His once wounded shoulder no longer ached. It had healed, but not rightly. A thick vein pulsed there now, a cord of translucent flesh beneath the skin, alive with a faint glow that throbbed like a heartbeat. His fingers had changed, longer, bonier, the nails dark and ridged. His left eye saw things the right did not, movements in shadows that shouldn't move, glimmers of light beneath dry stone, whispers curling from the mouths of dead things. He stood slowly, sand falling from his cloak in wet clumps. His imperial seal still hung around his neck, stained black, etched now with glyphs that hadn't been there before. He remembered Elspeth's smile, before she was taken, before she became one with the god, and it burned more than the cold. But he felt no tears. He felt purpose. Weeks later, he arrived at a riverside town within Rakeland's borders, bedraggled and hollow-eyed. The locals welcomed him at first. His imperial credentials remained intact, after all, and tales of an official lost on tax duty had reached their ears. They fed him, clothed him, and asked him for stories. He gave them silence, but he watched, and every night he walked to the banks of the Rake and stared into its depths, unmoving for hours, as though awaiting a command. Something inside him pulsed in tune with the current. Something beneath his skin itched to swim. And then the dreams began. Not for him, he no longer slept. For them, the townsfolk. Children whispered about a woman singing from the well. A fisherman hung himself after claiming he saw a city of bone at the bottom of the riverbed. 3 villagers walked into the river one morning and drowned themselves, hands clasped in prayer. When their bodies were recovered, gills were found carved into their necks. Their lungs held no water, only brine and spores. Aldrich simply watched. He moved from town to town, no longer asking for shelter. People offered it. He never asked for food. They gave it. Those who stood too near him became quiet, somber, drawn. They dreamt of tides. They dreamt of teeth. Some of them never woke. Back in Altdorf, strange things were being whispered in the halls of power. Imperial scholars unearthed a forgotten tithe ledger, one bound in salted leather, the ink faded and unreadable. It was recovered from a merchant ship wrecked along the Nordland coast. Every man who touched it fell ill with fevers and drowned in their own beds on dry land. An entire noble family disappeared during a stormless night. Their estate was found flooded. Their corpses were bloated, waterlogged. Yet the windows had never broken. In the south, villagers began carving glyphs into driftwood and leaving them at their doors during high tide. And always, somewhere in the crowd, he stood, not speaking, not interfering, just watching and waiting. One evening, a cart passed through the gates of Nuln, its wheels caked in river sludge. The driver was pale, hooded, his cargo sealed tight. When guards asked his purpose, he handed them a document bearing the seal of the Empire, wax-stamped with an emblem unfamiliar to any heraldry. Still, they let him through. That night, the river rose without rain. A pale light bloomed beneath the bridge. A boatman, drunk and laughing, jumped into the water on a dare. His body was never recovered. But days later, Children found his teeth in a pile on the shore, each one engraved with runic eyes. The tithe had been paid in Wulfgart, but the debt remained. An Eldric Mawgrave, tax collector of the Empire, now walked dry lands with salt in his blood and a god's will festering in his veins. He no longer served the Empire. He served the tide,